autocrat. And when an autocrat tells you what he is and what he's going to do, we should believe him. Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of The Count, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvan-Almanza. This is my co-host, Alana Sivan. So it's Monday, October 19th, and there are now 15 days remaining until Election Day, which means the election is happening right now. I voted over the weekend, and there are 15 days left until it is over. We're no longer going to say there's 15 days until the election because it is live, man. People are voting. Millions of people are voting all over the country. Tens of millions of voters actually have already cast their ballots. And so this is technically a show about the election, but is not really just about the election. This is a show about the way that Donald Trump and the Trump campaign and others who care more about power than about the nature of this nation will attempt to undermine the will of the voters, your will, your voice, and set aside the voted outcome on Election Day and seize an illegitimate second term for Donald Trump.
And just as importantly, this is about what ordinary people can do over the election cycle to fight back against Trump's assault on democracy. Over the past few episodes, we've spoken with some incredible activists and organizers and experts who have put together guides for people who are looking to fight back and engage in civil resistance. And it's really exciting because we're going to talk a little bit more about that today, because we know that Trump's plan can't work if we see it coming and are prepared to collectively rise up against it. So we are absolutely thrilled today to have a guest with us who will continue the theme of civil resistance in the face of an authoritarian threat. Maurice Mitchell is a renowned community organizer. He is the national director of the Working Families Party, which is a grassroots political party that works to elect progressive candidates for office. Maurice, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you. So talk to us a little bit about your and the Working Family Party's theory of change and how you plan to implement that theory of change in this election, and also in the event of an election where Donald Trump tries to subvert the will of the voters in the days following it.
Sure, thank you so much. So the Working Families Party is a grassroots political movement for the many, not the few. And we've been, for the past decades, building a grassroots sort of web of grassroots volunteers, grassroots elected officials, up and down the ballot, who are ultimately accountable to the interests of working people. Now, as we look at this election, one of the things I like to say is that 2020 is the great humbling, right? Nobody knew we would be in the conditions that we're in, right? And, this conversation is talking about the different scenarios that might happen. One of the things I like to stress is that the best defense is a great offense, right? So you said it yourself, there's people voting right now. We've seen people in long lines vote. It's not election day, it's election season, and election season is abound, right? Millions of people have already voted, and we want to ensure that as many people get out and vote as early as possible. Early vote is something that's happening all over the country, depending on what state you're in. You could mail in your ballots. There's so many different ways. And so much of the work that we're doing is ensuring that people understand. Some people, this is for the first time people are doing early vote, or people are doing mail-in ballots, how easy it is, the fact that it's safe, the fact that it's not only legit, like people have been mailing in their ballots for decades and decades, and ensuring that especially working class and poor folks and people of color all across the country have access to their vote. And if we're able to run up those numbers in a lot of places, then we think that that's really, really great for democracy. Now, we don't know what the scenarios might have for us, after Election Day. So we want to be prepared for any scenario, and there's a number of scenarios, right? There is a scenario where Donald Trump does what he says he wants to do, right? And he attempts to use all of his tactics in order to kind of gum up the works, right? And it's really important that I articulate this. Like, Donald Trump isn't a strong man. He's a weak man, strong man. He's a like a counterfeit strong man. He pines to be a strong man. He looks at Vladimir Putin and, you know, the Saudi royal family and some of these other folks with envy. And he is in many ways acting out because he understands that he's losing, right? So I always want to ground people in the fact that him lashing out in this way is actually a demonstration of people power. And it's like regimes that are on their way out generally lash out and start to do and say all types of wacky things to hold on to power. And that means we need to intensify our organizing. All the organizing that we brought into the fight since he's gotten here has brought us here. Over the past few months into the summer, the organizing of the movement for Black Lives, more than 26 million people hit the streets for justice for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and Black folks in general. That energy is being witnessed now in the election cycle, where so many Black folks are looking at the election as a referendum on Black lives, right? And so, you know, the far right and Trump also sees that, which is why they're afraid and they're flailing around and they're throwing around Antifa and all this other stuff. What my message is, don't be deterred. Keep your eyes on the prize. And there's things that we can do in order to change the balance. And so that's one of the reasons why the Working Families Party is partnering with the Movement for Black Lives Electoral Justice Project on a project called The Frontline, which is an opportunity for everyday people, meaning anybody that's listening right now, to get involved and not just vote, but to volunteer in order to talk to your neighbors, to talk to people in swing states, to help them be able to get their mail-in ballot, help them motivate them to go out and vote, and then post-election do everything necessary in order to defend the vote.
That sounds really exciting. Now, I want to dig in on the size of what you just talked about. You just talked about partnering with the Movement for Black Lives. You talked about encouraging participation. This is clearly a grassroots, like, inclusive movement.
That's right.
And we've talked on the show a bit about building sort of diverse working class coalitions that are unified in their mission to bring about change and make the government work for ordinary people for whom it is currently failing in epic ways. So some of the organizers we've talked to before have really reflected a lot on the need for unity in collective action, especially in this context, in this moment. Like, if the Trump campaign were to try to, you know, do some tricky stuff on the way out, how a people, ordinary people, could rise up in a way that was sufficiently unified to bring about change. How do you go about balancing the need to have a broad and diverse coalition while also building unity in your organization?
It's a really great question. You know, I think that the conditions that we're all experiencing are uniquely unifying, right? So we all have experienced unprecedented sort of tumult with COVID-19 collapsing global systems and exposing to everybody, the limitations and the failures of our economic system, of our healthcare system, exposing to everybody the limitations and failures of systemic racism, of the limitations and failures of neoliberal capitalism. So we're having this really broad conversation, just everyday people, around what is the role of the economy? When I'm socially distant from so many people, what is the role of my society? So this is actually a unique opportunity for everyday working people across difference, across race, to engage in one conversation about the solutions that it would take in order for us to get out of this crisis. And it creates a natural opportunity for coalition building, for a multiracial alignment of forces, for organizations and institutions recognizing that we're part of a bigger movement. And I've seen that happen in unprecedented ways. So going back to June, on Juneteenth, the Movement for Black Lives is a Black-led movement, but it showed up in a multiracial fashion. And there were actions everywhere, not just in big cities and not just in quote unquote blue states, in every single state.
I will note that in Laramie, Wyoming, I did see a Movement for Black Lives march that went on for like weeks and weeks and weeks. Laramie, Wyoming, just putting it out there.
That's right. I was going to say in Wyoming, in places where there's so few Black people. And what does that, to me, that is a proof point of what I just said. We're in a moment, a rare moment of solidarity. Now it's up to choose what we do in that moment of solidarity. And another thing that I think is really instructive is that all of the backlash against people coming together in order to ensure that we have a true democracy, and that this is where we're at, and that Black people could actually be safe. The backlash that's coming from the far right, to me, that demonstrates ultimately what's underneath far right ideology. Far right ideology only wins when we're divided, when we're cynical, when we're at our most cynical, when we're at our most sort of fearful, when we succumb to despair. That's when they win. And so when they see people coming together across region, across race, across gender, building a movement that is really inspiring and is even above politics, it's about developing a new we. When they see that, they get really scared because that directly is at odds with their project. They win when white Christian identity movements are mobilizing more and more people. They win when we're at odds with one another. They lose when our ideals and our values bring people together across difference. That's what social movements do when they're at their best. That's what we've seen over the past few months. To me, that is the strategy. And the last thing I'll say is, it also is about like recognizing all of our differences, right? We don't do ourselves any favor by collapsing our differences. And I think the movement for Black Lives does that very well. The movement for Black Lives is about justice for Black folks, but it is an invitation for all people to be on the freedom side, for all people to challenge white supremacy, right? The fight against white supremacy isn't a fight against Black people against white people. It's really a fight with all people against these structures, against white supremacy, against racism. And so it's an opportunity to develop a very, very sophisticated, very diverse grouping of people to do that. You know, there are Black immigrants. So I say the immigrant rights movement is a Black issue, right? Black people are on the front lines of the environment. So I say climate change is a Black issue. Working class Black people are the rank and file of so many of our labor institutions. So absolutely, labor rights is a Black issue. And you know, we're here talking about about our democracy. Democracy is a Black issue. So democracy, our democracy as we see it, is drenched in the blood of Black folks over centuries. You can't tell me that democracy is some abstract idea. It very much is rooted in the lived conditions of everyday Black folks. So I feel like the movement for Black Lives is actually a strategy to bring together people across difference, because Black people have been on the front lines of all of these fights.
What if I just take this clip and I keep it on my phone all the time, and anytime anyone asks me to explain this, I'm just going to hand over a clip of you talking? That's just going to be
Sounds good. I'm with it.
Just like
I'm taking it too.
Tight explanation right there. That was beautiful.
Sure.
That really was. I want to go back to something you said a little bit earlier, where you were saying that Trump is this weak wannabe Putin. Basically, I think it's sort of what you were saying. And it takes me to thinking about, listen, I think everybody, not everybody, but all of us here have always known that Trump is a bad leader, has bad policy. But I think it didn't take hold in everybody's minds early on that, or maybe it did, for a lot of us it did. But I think everybody has sort of their breaking point where they've realized that Trump isn't just a bad leader with bad policies. He's also an authoritarian, or a wannabe authoritarian. And so I'm curious to hear from you, like, when was your moment of realization, or maybe it was a collection of moments where you said, oh my goodness, we are dealing with an autocrat, with somebody who is really dangerous, not just in his policies, but sort of in his way of governing?
It's a really great question. And I have a nuanced response for you on that. Right. So for me personally, like, you know, based on my background, I never sort of was deluded by American exceptionalism. I think it has to do with my particular political journey, my particular family journey. Like, my dad is from a little tiny island nation called Grenada. Right. And I grew up I was born in the late 70s, and I grew up at a time when that island nation was subject to an invasion by the nation of my birth, right? And so, very early on, like I didn't really buy into American exceptionalism. I understood that this country has the capacity to do very bad things, very good things, and things in the middle, just like any other country. And that Americans, like all humans, are subject to all of the whims that any human being in any country could be sort of pulled by. So, folks in the United States, we looked at the genocide of Rwanda, and we were like, both horrified, but there was a certain distance. We looked at, the democracies in Latin America and we saw how the tumult in some of those countries, with some distance and some sort of sense of insurance that we lived in America, a place where those things don't happen, right? Those things don't happen here. Even today, there's people who still say, this is not us. Well, I have a rude awakening for people. This is us, right? Now, the question is, what are we going to do about it? So Donald Trump absolutely is a buffoonish, sort of worst case scenario Republican, but he is playing a role that is very advantageous for the Republican Party and the far right agenda, right? So he's not an aberration 100%. He is just a symptom of 40 years of neoliberal policies, 40 years of the breakdown of democracy. And when you think about it, it's actually makes sense that we're in a moment where Trump was able to a sort of buffoonish, larger than life sort of comedy character, right? Like was able to assume the presidency. And so, yes, absolutely. I knew very early that if we had Trump as the president, it would be a very, very, very bad thing. I think it's important that we still, I don't begrudge anybody for still being shocked. To me, that means that your humanity is still intact. We should still be shocked by these things. We should still be worried by these things. But, an emboldened Trump that has a second term, you could only imagine what he could do to the institutions of this country. And to me, if all of this stuff means, and we defeat Trump, and we must defeat Trump after this election season, most of us are disabused from the notion of American exceptionalism, and that we could finally see ourselves as we actually are. That's a good thing. And then that means that we could take seriously the responsibility of safeguarding, and not just safeguarding, but of course safeguarding and reimagining these institutions, understanding that these institutions are not insulated by some magic American force field, that these institutions need to be reimagined, re-explored, fortified every step of the way. And it's our job, each and one of us, every single day, to do that work to ensure that our democracy actually works. In the same way that folks in other countries need to safeguard their democracy, that has to happen in the United States.
I want to actually jump on that point that you just made, because the Working Families Party has this great reputation for and tradition of endorsing candidates who are unafraid to stand up for working people, even when doing so is difficult or politically risky. Like, I kind of want to sum it up as like candidates with a backbone, on stuff that really matters.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear from you how you think the ideal candidates for president or Senate or Congress should respond to a scenario in which Donald Trump manipulates the election or tries to stop the counting of legitimate ballots or seeks to have, alternate electors appointed, like situations that are really, really beyond the pale in terms of democratic norms. What would a candidate with a backbone do?
Well, I think it's actually really important. We need to build a united front that seeks to preserve democracy so that we could have it in the future to more perfect it, right? And in order to do that, there needs to be a very clear red line around the challenging of any of these norms, right? We know that Donald Trump has said that he will do these things. I think it's safe to say that he will attempt to do these things. I feel confident that we will defeat him, but to your question, the way that we defeat him is by shoring up all of these folks, right? Like, you can't, Working Families Party exists because we understand that having a D next to your name doesn't really say much about who you're accountable to, right? So people use the word progressive. People like to prop up Donald Trump as a boogeyman, but if you're going to say that you're against the Trump agenda, you're anti-Trump, you're pro-democracy, it has to mean something. So to me, just like with the movement for Black Lives, we've established that during the summer and in 2014, from the ashes of the Ferguson uprising, it was a which side are you on moment. With our democracy, we need to establish this is a which side are you on moment. There is no fence sitting, there's no gray area. You're either on the side of democracy or you're on the side of fascism. It's really that binary. It's that clear. And so there's a lot of work that we could do, everyday citizens, in establishing that as a norm, as a normative value, that when it comes to democracy, it is a binary choice. You're either on the side of democracy or you're on the side of neo-fascism or proto-fascism. And you need to choose right here and right now. There's no neutrality. Neutrality is actually adopting the side of neo-fascism in this case. And that needs to be the choice that we put in front of every single elected official. And we need to be unwavering. And that's actually one of the roles that Working Families Party often plays. We're unafraid of calling the question with people in power and getting them on record to say which side are they on. And we're going to need people to do that on the grassroots level.
I'm excited to hear that. It's just me over here by myself being excited to hear that.
I'm excited too.
I don't know how much time we have left, but I do want to plug one thing for folks who are listening and they're excited too, and they want to get involved. If you would indulge me, I just want to encourage people to get involved through the front line. And we could immediately assign you a role to play in defending your democracy, in getting out the vote, in telling the story to folks in your community that there's ways of voting in a safe way. And the thing that I want to say is that we need to reclaim the narrative and reclaim our democracy and the vote right now. Not only do we need to not de-escalate or make sure that Proud Boys aren't around at polling places, we need to ensure that people have joy when they go and vote. We've seen these long lines of folks, mainly a lot of working class and poor folks. We've seen multiracial groupings of folks in communities of color with these long lines. Our folks need to leave that experience feeling more emboldened, more connected, more assured that they have power. And so I want to encourage people to text Frontline to 30403 so that we could plug you into getting involved in some of those opportunities to make that true in your community.
All right. Send everybody in line pizza. Make sure.
And it's really easy too. They have a Slack group and you just join it. And
yeah, we tried to make it as easy as possible. It's as easy as possible. You just text. We got the Slack group. Somebody will greet you. We'll plug you in. And then, you could do things like ensuring that people have water and PPE while they wait online, and people have food and people are entertained. There's so many ways that you could show up for people in your community so that we could decide, not Donald Trump, not the far right, how we want to reclaim our democracy.
That's awesome. And I will, on your encouragement, I will say I am very lucky to be in a rural community where there is not a ton of voter suppression the way we've seen in states like Texas and Ohio. But I did go vote this weekend. The place was Cloroxed after every voter. You threw away your pen after you used it. Everybody had a mask on. It felt much, much safer than going to the grocery store. So I would encourage everyone who's thinking about whether to go vote now or to wait, go vote now. I mean, later is going to be more crowded. So go now while they still have all that Clorox spray.
That's right.
Early voting is here this weekend. So that's what I'm voting this weekend, Saturday, first day. I think we're going to wrap up now. So I think that's just a good point. We have more questions, but that was such a great ending.
It was 30403. Is that the text?
30403. And I have another plug. If you're watching from New York, vote on the Working Families Party line. It means that you're able to defeat Trump, but also establish that there's independent voters that are voting on our issues and our values. So I have to get all the plugs in there. So
your folks called me. I'm not even in New York anymore. And a Working Families Party person called me and was like, "Are you voting on the Working Families Party?" I was like, "I'm not in that state, but good on you for calling everybody."
Right on.
All right. Thank you so much, Maurice. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute joy having you. And we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Oh man. All right. So Maurice is got the best background in the business, and while he's figuring out his Zoom sign off, I'm gonna just quietly note, now that he's gone, we can talk about him behind his back, that there was a feature on him. Alana, you remember the feature in Business Insider? This
Yes.
was so beautiful. He sleeps like 2 hours a night. He gets up at like 4 a.m. He works harder than anybody on the planet and does it all for his son to make a better world. And I wanted to mention that because as someone, as a toddler mom myself, I find that really moving. And I think that's why basically everybody who cares about making this world a better place, why a lot of us are so driven to function on 2 hours of sleep a night, driven to not let anything hold us back, is because we're talking about existential threats to the planet, not just to our democracy, but to like the climate, to justice, to the way we function as a nation. So now that he's gone, I just wanted to mention how awesome that is and not embarrass him.
Yeah, and I thought what was really valuable about that too is I think of, like I have a lot of people in my life who say, it's great that you're involved and, you do all the politic things but that's not something I'm going to do because I want to focus on my family, or I, have to focus on taking care of my inner circle. And on one hand, I get that, but at the same time, it was really interesting to me to hear in that article him talk about, well, yeah, sometimes I don't get to spend as much time with my son, but I also, he makes me go so hard. He makes me do this work to create a better world for him. And that's sort of my obligation as a parent. So yeah, I think I wish we could, I want to send all of that message to our viewers too, that, we're creating a better world for the next generation. And that's sort of, you can do both.
And for all the people we love. I mean, like protecting people with pre-existing conditions is protecting my mom, is protecting my dad, is protecting, I mean, let's be real, like everybody has a pre-existing condition, but fighting for healthcare, fighting for better benefits for seniors and people with disabilities and people who are struggling, like fighting for the social safety net. Like we're fighting for everybody we love. So right. Yeah, I'm glad we got to talk with him. And I'm glad we didn't embarrass him by just telling him all that while he was here. All right. It's poll time. We got some new information out for y'all. New poll from Data for Progress and the Justice Collaborative finds that a majority of likely voters, including around 1/3 of Republicans, believe right now that Trump will try to interfere with election results. And that will either be with an attempt to stop counting the ballots. If he has the votes on election night, he will try to stop the count right there, or by outright voter fraud. And additionally, 45% of voters, so nearly half of the voters in this poll, believe that Trump and his campaign would succeed in disrupting the counting of ballots if they were to try. That's really shocking numbers of people, bipartisan belief that Donald Trump is trying to undermine democracy and will succeed if he tries to do so, which this poll kind of shook me a little bit. Like there's a lot of bad information that flows through the show, like bad as in very negative, but this poll was really troubling. So back with us today to discuss the results is Jason Gans, Chief of Staff, Data for Progress. Thank you, Jason, for being with us. I hope you had a restful weekend. Do we have Jason? There he is. He got a haircut. He got a haircut.
Wow, nice haircut.
Jason, are you muted maybe? I can't hear you.
Apologies. Yes, great to be back, folks. Yeah, so this poll was this poll certainly showed. So this.
Hold on one second, Jason. Before you dive in, let's pull up the poll so that our beloved viewers can see what we're talking about. And start with. I'd love for you to start with the sort of Republican admission here. There's a lot of Republicans that were ready to admit that Trump would be willing to cheat to win. So what do you think of that point in particular? Like his own party is saying, yeah, that guy's totally going to try to steal the election. What's going on with that?
I mean, like the fact of the matter is there's a large part of the Republican Party, essentially, I mean, all of the organized Republican Party that has stopped looking at democracy as a virtue. You think about Senator Mike Lee kind of proudly discussing about how we're not a democracy a couple weeks ago. Anytime, if you ever bring up the fact that, Trump lost the popular vote, the Senate is wildly unrepresentative, anything like that, you always hear people saying, oh, well, yeah, I mean, we're not a democracy, and that's what it's intended. Because, I mean, ultimately, for these people, what's right is, it's the thing that allows them to hang on to their minoritarian control of the country and not be able to kind of allow the emerging progressive majority to wield its power. So it's not super surprising to see that there are those among the Republican Party that are willing to go so far as to include actual legitimate voter fraud as being, within the legitimate tactics under the Republican Party. It's not all that different from when they stole the election in 2000.
I think what's particularly interesting about the poll as well is you also asked whether voters thought that Trump would try to use vote by mail specifically to steal the election, essentially. And the majority of people who responded said yes, including some Republicans. And what I find so interesting about that is that there are, we've known that this has been a Republican narrative, a Trump Republican narrative of Democrats are going to try to use mail-in ballots to steal the election. But if we look at this poll, let's pull up the poll. All right, there it is. We see that there's something else going on here. Jason, do you want to talk about what voters are thinking about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the thing we see here is, so it mirrors really close to the kind of overall results that we get. And so you continue to see, about 30% of Republicans being like, yeah, we probably would try and do that if we were put into this position. And then you see a really huge percentage of Democrats that are saying, oh, yeah, I'm concerned that Trump will try and stop the count of mail-in votes. I'm concerned that, we won't have a completely free and fair election, which I think, is a reasonable concern given everything that Trump has said about mail-in ballots. And this is just why it's so important for all of us to make sure that the vote actually does go through. I loved what Maurice was saying before about Donald Trump being a weak man, strong man, right? It's like he has the power, but he may say he has the power, but at the end of the day, we're the ones that can push back on him and say no. But that's only if we are able to kind of band together and reflect that. And yeah, so I mean, it's the fact that 70+% of Democrats are concerned that Trump might use vote by mail to steal the election is, it's really good on one hand because it does show that we are at least aware of these potential hiccups that might come in the electoral process. The downside, of course, is that, we don't want to discourage people from voting in any way, whether that is vote by mail, voting early in person, or voting on election day. We want to make sure that the message that voters are taking up from the kind of the election there is a risk that Trump will do shenanigans to try and stop the vote count, that there will be all sorts of different issues going forward. But at the same time, we do want to make sure, as we're talking to people, that it's they can only do this at the margins, right? And they might be able to win some smallish victories, but really all they can do is muddle the water. And if we are able to have such a powerful show of force on election day and throughout the election cycle, then no matter the kind of the intent of Trump and the Republicans, they won't be able to overcome this.
I'm going to flag that you use the word shenanigans because we're going to talk about some shenanigans later. The word shenanigans will now feature heavily in our show for reasons that will become clear in about 20 minutes. So Alana mentioned, or maybe it was you, Jason, who mentioned I think it was you, the lasting trauma of the Bush v. Gore 2000 election and the sort of electus interruptus where everybody was lastingly mentally harmed by not having the votes get counted and by having the count get stopped. and having a concession happen before everybody's vote had been considered and included. So the last question in this poll you had asked was whether respondents believe that Trump would actually succeed in stopping the count of ballots if he were to try. And this was really interesting to me because this to me went all the way back to the trauma that Democrats still carry over Bush v. Gore, because Democrats were more confident or maybe more concerned that Trump would actually be able to pull this off and stop the counting, which is, I think, the most frightening thing and the thing that we're going to get into later, because that is, in fact, according to Steve Bannon, the plan is to try to stop the count. So let's put up that last set of results for Jason to tell us what's going on here.
Yeah. So what you see here is that there are a substantial amount of Democrats and voters overall that believe that Trump would be successful in his disruption of counting the ballots. And this is obviously the nightmare scenario, right? Where we go into election day, we see results which are trending Trump, and then we're pretty confident that the remaining ballots have enough to actually put Joe Biden over the edge. But somehow, through their control of state legislators, through their court, which they have essentially delegitimized through their behaviors over the past several cycles, and the 6-3 Supreme Court, including Amy Coney Barrett, would be able to go and put a stop to this. And it's a very, very real concern that everyone should be aware of. And the good news, again, just keeps coming back to the fact that if we make it close enough that they can't steal it, there's nothing that they can do. And even if they do try and steal it, then there are tactics that we have at our disposal. The important thing is, like we were saying before, is that we continue to build the power throughout the movements and throughout all the actors within it, such that if the election is in the realm where a strategy such as this could hypothetically be successful, and given that if Trump were to try and do this, which, is pretty high likelihood he would, then that's the time for civil disobedience on a scale we've never seen before, for massive protests and movements to hit the streets and really make it clear that every vote must be counted.
Mm. Well, Jason, thank you so much. Every vote must be counted is always the place I'm going to be tempted to end on, to keep that stuck in everybody's head. So thank you so much for joining us and for walking us through today's polls.
Thanks for having me.
Be talking with you more this week. Oh, I can't. So here's the thing. We're talking about like minority rule, where half the people, the majority of people really, are saying, oh my goodness, I am totally confident that this guy is going to try to cheat to secure minority rule. And the minority of people are being like, heck yeah, he's going to cheat to get us minority rule, which it takes me back to this article that you sent me about a week or so ago in the Washington Post by Robert O'Hara Jr., where he reports on an event put together by this group in which conservative Justice Clarence Thomas's wife is a member, the Council for National Policy, which this article reports how speakers at this event talking about the policies of minority rule in this country basically said this is a fight between good and evil, where we, meaning the GOP, do everything that we can to win. And referring to mail-in ballots, another speaker said, we need to stop those ballots from going out. And I want the lawyers here to tell us what to do, which, by the way, like if there's legal strategizing happening in a room with a Supreme Court justice's wife involved in the group, like
And by the way, there's someone else involved in that group who is like an unofficial judicial advisor to Trump as well.
I mean, so judges are supposed to avoid the appearance of impropriety. I would think that would apply to the Supreme Court, but apparently not anymore. But kind of coming back to this, I guess I wanted to get your take on what it means that we're living in a country where we've got a minority of people who see the world in such strangely bright good and evil terms that they acknowledge their president's readiness to cheat, and they are good with it, even if it lights democracy on fire.
It's probably one of the most dangerous things that I can think of right now. because we've talked a lot about on this show with Maurice and some of our previous organizer and activist guests about how important it is for unity in civil resistance. And we see that there is some unity on the side of Trump supporters against democracy and in favor of this autocratic regime. And that just means that we have to organize 10 times harder, and that we need to take all of these tactics and tools that have been laid out for us in, Kifa and Hardy's guidebook, in the front line, and all these other tools, so that when it comes time to but when it comes time to ensure that every single vote is counted, that we have all the people power that we need, because we already see right now from some of these results that the Republicans have the people power to be able to potentially give Trump a second term, even when he hasn't earned it. And so, it's both scary, but it also highlights the need for us to organize. And particularly, and when I'm taking that together, what we heard today with sort of the collective movement that's happening right now, I do still have a lot of faith, because I do think that there has been that organizing happening already, and that people will be ready to get together when the time is necessary to be able to stand up and fight for the democracy that we need.
Yeah. I mean, when you say people power, it's so funny because we mean that so differently. Like when we talk about people power on the side of democracy, and I will cast it in terms of pro-democracy and anti-democracy, because that's really where we are now. We're not really talking about conservative liberal or conservative liberal progressive. We're talking about,
like you said, you have to take a side.
Yeah. Pro-democracy, and we talk about people power, we're talking about organizing, we're talking about peaceful demonstrations, we're talking about civil resistance. When you say people power on the other side, you're talking about like guys in fake military uniforms showing up to polling places, and like, Republican state senators being willing to appoint fraudulent electors. It's like a really different, one side puts the emphasis on people in people power, and the other puts aside the emphasis on power. Even if that power is illegitimate or corrupt or unfair.
And they tell themselves that they're doing it for the people, right? This is a fight between good and evil.
That's good and evil.
They know what good is better than the people.
Wow. Speaking of terrifying corruption, maniacal, messianic fixations on good and evil, and all of that, Alana, do you happen to have a couple of button-down shirts you could put on right now?
Oh, I sure do.
Do you have maybe 2 or 3?
Oh, let me see if
we need a lot of collared shirts for this next segment. How many collared shirts can we? I have 3. I've got my black one. I've got my plaid. Let's go with another.
I think I might only be able to give you 2 today. I mean, come on.
It's okay. 5 between us. I think we're actually in pretty good shape, because in this next segment, y'all, we are talking about one particular Republican who likes
to all your collars stick out.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Should we pop them? Should we?
Yeah.
Okay. There we go. So one particular Republican. Oh, I got to unbutton the top button because he's never this buttoned up. There we go. Who is admitting in his own way that Donald Trump is not just planning to cheat to win, but how he's planning to cheat to win, and what exactly. I mean, we're talking times, we're talking locations, we're talking statements. What exactly Donald Trump is planning to do to cheat to win on election day. And that Republican in the many, many collared shirts, of course, is none other than Steve Bannon, the one-time Trump campaign manager, the right-wing media executive, the recent arrestee on federal fraud charges, that Steve Bannon. Bannon is now hosting a podcast and giving presentations to Republican groups.
They let anyone host shows these days, really.
They really do. The standards. Here's what's amazing. Steve Bannon is making the rounds right now, talking to people about a supposed Democratic plan to steal the 2020 election.
That's right. The Democratic plan to steal the election. Remember what we said about when a cheater is cheating, they accuse you of cheating?
Don't make me think of Steve Bannon as my cheating boyfriend.
That's who he is. I mean, and it's really uncanny, but it's also exactly what you'd expect from Trump's most committed propagandist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm guessing that most of our viewers, some of our viewers might be masochists. I'm guessing that most of our viewers are not, and would prefer not to sit through hours of Steve Bannon talking. But luckily for you, we are masochists and we did it so that you don't have to, because we love you and we care about you and we do horrible things for you. It was awful. But now we can take you through step by step the supposed Democratic plan to steal the election. And what's really astonishing about it, we talk a lot about projecting, right? About how Trump himself and now Bannon and others on that sort of anti-democracy team tends to accuse others of doing whatever they happen to be doing at the moment. Today or yesterday, Donald Trump accused the Biden family of being like a crime syndicate, which was really amazing to me, given the sheer number of allegations of fraud and crime and personal profit off of our government that have been lodged against the Trump family. But it's that, I'm rubber, you're glue type of projecting an argument. And Steve Bannon's now doing the same thing. So ironically enough, this was at an appearance in front of the Young Republican Federation in Virginia last week. Bannon said that Democrats had overplayed their hands by talking about their plan as he went into a meeting and publicly talked about their plan. It's a hall of mirrors in here.
Yeah, and the first thing that I think we all need to recognize about Bannon is that he's no dummy. He knows what he's doing. And when he talks about the election, he knows the contours of the Electoral College, of election law, and he knows very well about the phenomenon of the red mirage and the blue shift. He knows that on election day, there might be a chance that Donald Trump will appear like he's more ahead, and that lead will evaporate very quickly once mail-in ballots are counted. And most of those mail-in ballots will lean blue.
Yeah, I think when you're a trial lawyer, you often try to do this thing where you tell the jury what's going to happen. It works really well if you do it right. Like when you know you're in front of, a jury and the prosecutor always makes the same silly argument in their opening or closing. You're like, she's going to get up here and she's going to say this to you. And then the jury loves that you know what the prosecutor said. I think Steve Bannon's trying to pull off the same trick here. Like we all know there's going to be a red mirage and a blue shift. And I think that Bannon looks at the dramatic lack of support for Donald Trump, looks at the fact that there will be a strong blue shift because of the pandemic, and senses this opportunity and is trying to find some way to seem credible, some way to use the reality we're living in of pandemic, red mirage, blue shift to his advantage. And he is smart, and this is a smart way to spin it. But here he is at that same event in Virginia last week, claiming in the only way he can, given the facts in front of him, that the only votes that should really count are in-person votes. Let's hear it.
Then I start seeing polling. 69 to 75% of the Democrats are traumatized. Not just low information voters, the elites are worse, they're traumatized. They do not want to go stand in line and vote. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a game changer, right? It's what electorate shows up to vote on a vote that can be certified.
So, as we've mentioned before, Bannon often calls calls the election day results Trump's game day vote. And in Trump world, you have to pass some sort of rite of passage to have your vote counted. And that rite of passage is showing up and standing in massive lines because of voter suppression in person on game day. And in Trump world, the game day vote is the only vote that should count. Because, of course, those are the votes that are most likely to favor Donald Trump. Unsurprisingly, Steve Bannon does not like the phrase created by academics for this phenomenon, which is red mirage. He likes to refer to it as the bold red predicate, as if it is some sort of prior felony. And instead of the blue shift, he calls it, Alana, are you ready? Are you ready?
Oh, right.
The blue steel. Our Zoolander joke will never get old. I hope it never gets
I still love it. I don't care.
So like this steal does not involve, it's not just bogus, baseless claims of fraudulent ballots, which, by the way, like, are bogus and baseless. It is very, very easy to check the validity of mail-in ballots because they are signed and they are in security envelopes and they are matched against voter rolls. But during a presentation to the Colorado Tea Party last week, Bannon claimed that Democrats might even I have to back up. Bannon claimed that Democrats might shut down polling places. Bannon, in a world where Governor Greg Abbott is making maskless but very few polling places and only one ballot drop-off box per county, in a world where Ohio voters are having to like stand in line because they've been deprived of open polling places, and in a world where Trump supporters are putting on their faux military uniforms and like showing up to intimidate voters at polling places, Bannon is claiming Democrats are going to shut down polling places to hurt Trump's election day count. Which to me, again, it's that priming, right? It's when your voters show up to vote and there's a mile, 8 miles long, you want them to think, oh, this is the Democrats' fault. It's the exact type of priming one might do with a jury. Anyway, this is next level projection and it's very manipulative. It's gaslighting, considering like the fervent Republican enthusiasm for voter suppression.
Right. And so he tried to back up at his Virginia event, he tried to back up his claims of the blue steel by talking about the 2018 Arizona election. And we've talked about that election before, and it's a nice illustration of the blue shift. Election day, Martha McSally looked like she was in the lead. More mail-in ballots were counted, and then the lead shifted to Kyrsten Sinema. And in describing that election, he said, and I quote, "They just keep counting. They just keep counting until they win." Yes, Steve Bannon. When there are votes, you count them and you keep counting them until all the votes are counted and there is a winner. You're just mad that it was
how you do
a Democrat.
Democracy. Yeah.
So, it's appalling that he has sort of taken this natural thing that happens during elections, which is the blue shift, and is trying to use it to encourage the Trump campaign and work with the Trump campaign really to subvert the results of the election. And what's really interesting about this is he knows that this is the only way that Trump can win. The only way Trump can win is if he says on election night, hey, I won, don't count any of the votes. And what's funny is at that Virginia event, he predicts that Trump will do just that. Let's play that clip right now.
At 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock, you can write this down the day you heard it, the moment you heard it. On November 3rd, Donald J. Trump's going to walk in the Oval Office, and he may hit a tweet before he goes in there and see if Jack Dorsey's got the stones not to put it up. And he's going to sit there having won Ohio and being up in Pennsylvania, in Florida. And he's going to say, hey, game's over, right? That's the bold red predicate.
No, that's just calling an election completely illegitimately with none of the information. It's not bold, might be red, but it is certainly not a predicate for anything. Look, breaking down the statement, like there's layers. So first of all, election night, 10 or 11 p.m., 7 or 8 p.m. on the West Coast, like the election is way not over. Not in an election where there will be like perhaps millions of votes not yet counted across this country. Not an election that is in an unprecedented year when we had a global pandemic, which of course Bannon disputes the veracity of, and we'll talk about that in a second. But so we're talking about way before the election is over. Donald Trump is going to write a tweet before he goes into the Oval Office. So even earlier, he will have written a tweet. And he
predicted that, by the way.
Yeah. Whether Jack Dorsey will have the stones to put it up. I think what he's referencing there is if you try to call an election like in the evening on election, like the evening of election day, when we all know it's not going to be counted for like days, if not weeks, that is putting false information on Twitter. Will Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, have the willingness to flag that as false information? That's really the question that Bannon is already asking there. So I guess what's what's shocking to me, this is exactly the situation we talked about in polling last week, which is, that voters would believe a Trump tweet calling the election for himself before the election is anywhere near over. I mean, the finish line is not even in view at that point. But this is not like conspiracy theory stuff. This is Trump's own chief propagandist openly telling people exactly what is going to happen and when it is going to happen, and how it is going to happen. So I think what we have to do with this information is take it, digest it, prepare for it, encourage Biden and the Democrats to prepare for this moment, encourage Jack Dorsey to prepare for this moment, encourage the media writ large to prepare for this moment, and refuse to accept any assertion that the election is over before all of us get our votes counted. And that includes Republican votes, by the way. I mean, there's a lot of people who will be waiting to have their voice heard in the days that follow the election. But of course, Steve Bannon does not like the idea of anyone putting up a fight against this bold-faced subversion of democracy. He would prefer, you will be surprised to learn, that everyone just kind of roll over and let Donald Trump tweet his way back into an illegitimate second term. And Bannon, in this next moment, basically says that anyone who's not willing to roll over in that manner is trying to steal the election from Donald Trump instead of the other way around. Let's see it.
If Hillary Clinton's going to sit there and say, under no circumstances, none, is Joe Biden going to concede? We're not going to concede. We're not going to allow this election to be stolen, either through some shenanigans in the courts or some shenanigans in mail-in ballots that nobody can actually process. That will not happen. And the way to make sure it doesn't happen is, number one, set the predicate on November 3rd. Once we set that predicate, that Trump's the winner on Election Day, that is mighty hard to unwind.
Emily, I have so many things to say. The first one is sorry to our viewers for making you sit through these videos, Steve Bannon. But what I really want to talk about too is all of the gaslighting that is going on here. I mean, first of all, let's start out with Clinton. What Hillary Clinton said was, do not concede if the election is close. And why? Because we need to count all of the votes. Right? Like, we need to count the votes. And that makes sense because that's what democracy is. Yeah. And let's talk about the other way that he's gaslighting his viewers. So he also talks about, quote unquote, shenanigans in the court. And there are so many problems with him calling it that. First of all, when he has talked about the Supreme Court, he has said, I'm going to pull this up. He told his audience in another part of this presentation that you need 9 justices right now. They've forced it, Bannon said. You need a 9th justice because it's all coming to the Supreme Court.
Can I just quickly point out that what that means is even a majority conservative court might not uphold the level of shenanigans they're going to pull.
Right. And Donald Trump has said very similar things as well. In the first debate, he said we're counting on the Supreme Court to look at the ballots. Counting on the Supreme Court to look at the ballots. That's shenanigans. That's courtroom shenanigans right there. And it's, again, so mind-blowing how much projection is going on here. And get this, Bannon also complained that the Democrats were assembling a team of lawyers to fight the post-election legal battle. This is after he has said that Trump will be fighting to throw away as many ballots as possible. So basically what he is saying is, how dare you, Democrats? How dare you fight for votes to be counted? You are stealing it with all of these blue votes. And it's just disgusting, to be perfectly honest. And we are just going to show you one more clip. And then after that, we will spare you the Bannon clips. But I think everybody needs to see it because it underscores how cynical and disgusting this Trump worldview of democracy is.
Remember, every ballot that can be certified should be certified, and that ballot should count. That's a vote. But you've got a lot of things you got to check off. to get the certification because you chose not to go to a poll. And the reason you chose is your mass media apparatus, which is dominant in this country, was irresponsible and caused mass hysteria on your voters. That's your problem. You're not going to make your problem the nation's problem. And we will not back down 1 inch. And I tell you who's going to join us in that. A guy named Donald J. Trump. He is not prepared, given everything he's given up, given everything he's been through, being everything he's accomplished and yet to accomplish and will accomplish, to sort this country out and to take on these elites that have been in back of the managed decline of the greatest nation on earth. He is not going to go quietly into that good night, trust me. Because he's going to put up a big victory on the 3rd. And he's going to want his troops to back him up on that.
Well, if we're quoting Dylan Thomas, I might point out that the rest of that poem says old age should burn and rave at close of day. And here we certainly see old age burning and raving quite a bit. I think I'm going to break down why blaming voters for the dysfunction of our democracy is a really, it's quite a move. But I'd first like to say something about why everybody seeing this should feel angry. I'm not trying to tell you how to feel, but what we're seeing here, this is the fundamental principle of any representative system of government, is that voting gives the people the power to ask for what they want. They get to say how they want their country to run and what they need and what types of supports and opportunities they want created in this nation. And when you see someone saying, well, sure, I'll count your vote if you checked all the right boxes, but I'm sure going to make it hard for you to check the right boxes if you're not voting in person on election day. What that person is saying is, I don't want you to get a say because you don't agree with me. And I think the reason we're dividing this so much into pro-democracy and anti-democracy is because a lot of us, way more of us, want to hear from everybody, even if they don't agree with us, than this minority who's trying to seize power and try to silence anybody who doesn't agree in their authoritarian ideas. But let's break this down. Steve Bannon here is saying that if you chose to vote by mail because you are living in a pandemic that has run amok in this country because of the wild mismanagement of Donald Trump and Mike Pence, if their mismanagement of our pandemic, which has resulted in our economy being harmed more than it needed to be, in us still not being able to socialize without masks, in our basically still being a nation paralyzed by a pandemic, that is somehow not their fault. It's your fault as the voter who chooses to vote by mail, a completely legitimate and safe mechanism that the government provides to you.
It's pure victim blaming.
Really.
Really.
It is victim blaming. Yeah, this kind of goes back to Bannon as the abusive cheater type. I mean, it's just it's gaslighting. It's saying, this is your fault. It's your fault that we're not counting your vote. We're harming you and it's somehow your fault. Mm-hmm. You made me punch you. That.
We created all of these barriers to you voting. And because you weren't able to overcome every single one of them, shame on you.
Yeah, exactly. It's not anything short of gaslighting the entire voter population. I mean, it's just everyone who sees this, I hope, would feel offended and furious at being told to shut up and go away.
Yeah. And it's kind of infuriating that Bannon can do this and keep a straight face. It's kind of, again, you're exactly right. It's again like this sort of a mentally abusive person who blames the American people for trying to take care of themselves, trying to take care of their democracy, trying to make it so that they can vote safely and exercise their voice within this world and this country, and saying, you didn't do it the way that I told you to, and shame on you for that. And it goes right into this playbook. It goes right into the playbook of let us use the courts, let us use these voter suppression laws to prevent people from voting, and then tell them it's their fault. But you know what? As shameless as this all is, he's telling us exactly who he is. And he's telling us who Donald Trump is. He laid it all out there. He's not denying it. He's not pretending like he's a good guy who cares about the will of the people. And so it all comes back to this idea that we've been saying over and over again in this show. When an autocrat tells you who he is, you need to believe him. And that's what we need to do. We need to believe Steve Bannon. We need to believe Donald Trump when they say that they are going to try to subvert the will of the people.
Absolutely. And like we said, the only way we can stop all of this from coming to pass is to vote in record numbers, to vote in a way that makes you feel certain your vote is getting counted. Get it done early, whether it's by mail or in person, like get it done. You probably can in your state. If not today, then within the next week. So get that voting done. And we heard from the top of the show and in last show about unity and the need for people to be ready to be in the streets chanting, count those votes if we have to be. So thank you for sticking with us on this wild ride. This has been another episode of The Count. We're going to be back actually tomorrow at 4 o'clock and here every day at 4 o'clock. Ben Sheehan is going to be here to talk with us about what the 1876 election can tell us about 2020. And as you know, those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it. So y'all better be here, 4 o'clock, same place. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. This is Alana Sivan. We'll see you tomorrow.